Good evening. On behalf of the Grant Monument Association, welcome to this special online program to mark President Ulysses S. Grant's 198th birthday. By way of introduction, the Grant Monument Association, or GMA, is a nonprofit that was organized during the 1990s as the successor to the organization of the same name that originally built and administered Grant's tomb in New York City until it was transferred to the National Park Service. The GMA is dedicated to the preservation of Grant's tomb, which is the largest mausoleum in the Western Hemisphere. An important part of our mission is to foster education about the life and legacy of General Grant, the principal author of Union victory during the Civil War and our nation's 18th president. In recent years, we revived the GMA's tradition dating back to the 19th century to commemorate Grant's birthday with a dinner in New York City. The dinner program each year has been an educational one, highlighted by a colloquy in which General David Petraeus interviews a historian about different aspects of Grant's story. Another annual tradition is the official commemoration of Grant's birthday at his tomb, an impressive ceremony organized by the National Park Service and the United States Military Academy at West Point. Because of the pandemic we are all experiencing, both events have been canceled this year. But we thought it was important to recognize Grant's birthday, and that's why we've come together online to observe it with a colloquy we can bring to you at home. This also means that we can reach a great many people who otherwise would not have been able to make it to dinner in New York. For those of you joining us for the first time, we encourage you to check out the Grant Monument Association's website at grantstomb.org to learn more about the story behind the monument and how you can help in its preservation. We thank you for joining us. We hope you are staying safe, and we hope to see you again before too long when the present challenge is behind us and Grant's tomb is once again open to the public. Before I turn this over to our guests, I would like to extend special thanks to the National Park Rangers and volunteers who are caretakers of the tomb. They are sharing this program with their audience and keeping watch over the monument during this period of temporary closure. Let me also thank the KKR Global Institute, which has provided us technical assistance for tonight. We are honored to have with us one of General Grant's most distinguished successors in the pantheon of American military leaders. General Petraeus is now the chairman of KKR and previously served for 37 years in the Army. He has been a household name since he first came to national prominence during the Iraq War, where he displayed leadership so impressive that many justifiably consider him America's greatest living commander. Tonight, he will be speaking with another special guest whom we are glad to welcome back. Elizabeth Samet is a professor of English at West Point. Her expertise on both military and literary matters is exceptional and is evident in her 5 books. Her most recent title is The Annotated Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, a work of tremendous scholarship that has greatly enriched our understanding of Grant's classic autobiography. I should also point out on her behalf that she is with us tonight in her personal capacity, so the views she expresses are her own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the US government. We are especially glad Professor Samet could join us because if the annual birthday ceremony at Grant's tomb had gone forward today, she would have been the keynote speaker. By the way, both of tonight's panelists will be featured in a 3-part series on Grant that the History Channel will air starting on Memorial Day, May 25th. With that, I hope you all stay safe and will now turn the program over to General Petraeus. General?
Well, thanks very much, Frank, for the kind introduction. Thanks for elevating me at KKR. I wish I were the chairman of KKR. I'm actually the chairman of the KKR Global Institute and a partner in the firm. And thanks to all those in the audience for joining us for this virtual celebration of Grant's 198th birthday. It is great to be back with the Grant Monument Association, a wonderful organization led so superbly by Columbia professor Frank Scaturo an organization that has done so much to refurbish and maintain the magnificent monument in which Grant and his wife, Julia, are buried, and also the organization that does so much to preserve the legacy of the distinguished general who truly did save the Union. It's also a pleasure to be on a virtual stage this evening with Professor Elizabeth Samet, a highly respected professor of English at the U.S. Military Academy for over 20 years now, and the author, as you heard, of several highly acclaimed works. I have known and admired Elizabeth for well over a decade. She is a true lyricist with words and a consummate student of history, literature, and soldiers at war. With her annotated memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, she demonstrates those attributes convincingly once again. After reading the pre-publication copy, in fact, I described the book as an enthralling, brilliant, illuminating, and unique contribution that helps return Ulysses S. Grant to the pinnacle on which he belongs. But Michael Dyrda of the Washington Post captured the essence of her book far better than that. He wrote, "The annotated memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant is everything a work of popular scholarship should be: authoritative, thorough, and compulsively readable. Where many annotated editions come across as perfunctory and unimaginative, this one truly illuminates its text with an abundance of relevant historical, biographical, and literary material. For a first-time reader," Dyrda continues, "the book dispels several half-truths and myths. Back in the 1950s, when I was growing up in Ohio, school children were regularly taught certain facts about the Civil War. Notably, that the Confederate General Robert E. Lee wasn't only a superb military tactician, but also the 19th century equivalent of Chaucer's perfect gentleman knight. By contrast," Dyrda observes, "Lee's northern counterpart, Ulysses S. Grant, would typically be characterized as a drunk with a certain brute aptitude for command." Samet, he notes, utterly rejects this view of Grant, as well as all the romantic hooey still surrounding Lee and the Confederacy. The so-called lost cause was, as Grant firmly declared, unholy, and at its heart festered the immoral enslavement and exploitation of men, women, and children. Well, congratulations on a wonderful review, Elizabeth. Congratulations on a terrific annotated version of Grant's memoirs, and welcome to this virtual stage.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today.
So let's begin. You refer to Grant as your Virgil, as someone who has been your guide in many ways over the years. Obviously, he's a natural subject for historians, especially military historians, but what brought someone who teaches and is trained in literature to this man and to his memoirs?
Well, originally, I think Grant wasn't someone I thought a lot about until I actually stumbled on the memoirs. So the memoirs themselves, the book itself really was what introduced me to Grant, and ultimately to West Point and to military culture. He did not fit my preconceptions of what a 19th century general would be like. And I was struck as I read the memoirs, this was back in graduate school, by the modesty, the plain speech, the humor. There's a humor that I think it's sometimes easy to miss in the memoirs. Brutal and bleak as its subject is, there are some wonderful portraits and wonderful humorous anecdotes throughout. This was someone who admitted his great love of novels, and he had a great deal of care for language. And so to someone who was working on a PhD at the time in English, this was a great surprise to me and a great delight. This was someone who was keen that he would always put his meaning in prose so plainly that there could be no mistaking it. And that's often something I share with my own students as an aspiration.
You've suggested some of the reasons Grant's book is widely regarded as among the finest military memoirs ever written. And the man himself is, I think, justifiably enjoying something of a resurgence of late. In fact, Grant Monument Association dinner attendees have enjoyed hearing Joan Waugh, Ron White, Ron Chernow, and you on their books on Grant in the past several years. Nonetheless, his reputation has seen considerable ups and downs over the decades in the past century. How have succeeding generations remembered or perhaps forgotten this man who was the most celebrated figure of his own age?
His reputation has been extremely volatile over the years, and you have mentioned several of the people who have really brought him to the fore most recently. When he died, as you note, he was the world's most famous American. He had had a world tour after his presidency and was greeted by throngs of people throughout, and then on his return home, the same thing. And Joan Waugh's book does a tremendous job of illuminating that facet of Grant. He always had his enemies, of course, and I think ultimately his reputation fell victim to a couple of things, mostly political. He was a victim of the Great Reconciliation movement and the Lost Cause movement that emerged in force really as soon as the war ended, but particularly after the end of Reconstruction with the compromise in the late 1870s, 1876 election. And he went from a hero to a goat. And it really wasn't until the middle of the 20th century with the pioneering work of Lloyd Lewis and Bruce Catton that his reputation began to be resurrected. And I also think the presidency, which had its ups and downs, had something to do with it as well, because anyone who wants to celebrate Grant has to reckon with that presidency too.
And of course, the memoirs, as we'll touch on later, don't get to the presidency. They really end with the end of the war.
Right.
And of course, they ended with the end of his life as well. Well, you've pointed to some of the factors that have contributed to the volatility of his reputation, but the epigrams that you've chosen for your edition from Gertrude Stein, from General Sherman, and from Charles Dickens all seem to point to a certain inaccessibility or unknowability. How much did his own personality contribute to the way in which he was remembered and interpreted?
Well, I think maybe Lew Wallace, the general who's famous for two things, getting lost at Shiloh and writing Ben-Hur after the war, he knew a little something about drama, and he said that if Grant had studied to be undramatic, he could not have succeeded better. And I think Grant knew what he was doing, but also was someone who sort of absented himself. He feels sometimes absent from the memoirs. He's scrupulous in not recounting any battles in which he wasn't a part of, but he really is not the hero of his own tale in that way. He doesn't put himself forward, I think, the way that Sherman does to a greater degree in his own memoirs. And he's also not the villain. I mean, he's hard to cast as a villain. Sherman, and this is one of the epigraphs you referred to in the beginning of the book, says that Grant is a mystery to him, and he thinks that Grant was a mystery to himself. I think Sherman's being a little coy there. I think Sherman actually understood Grant quite well. But there is a sense that Grant was not studied in that way and was not performing, but was just sort of doing what came naturally to him. And that he also combined that with the fact that he was not a great talker, not a great speech maker, and was a listener. And I think that kind of inaccessibility probably did contribute to the difficulties, perhaps, with which subsequent biographers and historians have had to contend.
Including you.
Right.
Well, the market was flooded with Civil War veteran memoirs during the latter part of the 19th century, but Grant, for a long time, refused to write a memoir. What finally prompted him to do so?
Well, you're right. Most of the generals who fought the Civil War spent the rest of the 19th century refighting it on the page. And Grant decided not to do that. Sherman as well. Not until 1875 did Sherman write his memoirs, because he was so outraged by what he regarded as all the lies being sold that he wanted to correct the record. Grant still resisted until a series of events late in his life changed his mind. This began a sort of series of misfortunes, a December 1883 fall on an icy New York sidewalk. And then in May of 1884, the great scandal of Grant and Ward, a firm actually that his son was a partner in with Ferdinand Ward, who was known as the young Napoleon of finance and was a swindler. And it was Grant's money that bankrolled the firm, and all of it was lost. Then that summer, in the process of, he was in New Jersey for the summer, he was eating a peach and evidently felt a great stinging sensation in his throat, waited until the fall to get a diagnosis. By that time it was too late, and he had cancer, and there was nothing they could do. So in order to make sure that his family would be provided for, he decided to write the memoirs. He had already written a few articles and was encouraged by many, but it was really Mark Twain who said, "I will give you a good deal and we'll sell this by subscription." The book was sold by sales agents, many of whom were veterans of the Civil War, and ultimately sold, hundreds of thousands of copies. And this netted over $400,000 to Julia, which of course in today's money would be a significantly larger sum. So he saved the day, and he did what he was always best at, which is meeting the emergencies.
In fact, he did his final exits literally in his final days, as you will recall.
Right.
Now, Grant's subject, as I mentioned earlier, is the war, not the presidency. In what ways does his representation of war differ from those by his contemporaries and by other writers who have attempted to capture this very difficult and sometimes elusive subject?
I think he steers what I like to think of as a middle course. It's not at all romantic. He has no illusions about war. And there isn't the sort of novelistic quality, although there's a great narrative drive to the memoirs. There isn't really the novelistic quality, the sort of 19th century romantic quality attaching to the Civil War for him, or to the Mexican War for that matter, nor is he satiric. And so I think he, as I said, steers that middle way. He never takes delight, he never revels in the brutality or even in the heroism, even though he recognizes heroism when he sees it. And the narrative is throughout characterized by a really clear-eyed prose, a lean, spare prose. And as I've suggested, it does have a great momentum. He really was a writer who could tell a story. And so one is really swept up in the narrative of the Civil War. There are, as the historian James McPherson and others have noted, a couple of moments where his health was in a pretty desperate strait, where the momentum flags a bit, but that really is only intermittent, and he really picks it up at the end, and you're swept sort of relentlessly toward Appomattox and the close of the war.
We can see why you're a great English professor as well. From his youth, Grant was a gifted trainer and rider of horses. Can you tell us how horses became so important to him and what role they played ultimately in his personal and professional life?
Sure. I like to think of him as a horse whisperer, the original horse whisperer. There's that great military tradition going back to Alexander the Great of a sort of rite of passage where warriors tame horses that no one else can ride. So Alexander and Bucephalus. And Grant had this experience actually at West Point during the graduation exercises. Horsemanship was a fairly new course of study at the academy, and he was the best equestrian in the academy. And at the graduation exercises, took a famously difficult horse and jumped higher than anyone had jumped before. And it was really quite a spectacle. He started with horses in his youth. He would ride long distances on his own with a wagon sometimes, transporting people, or just riding around for his own pleasure. His father, as most everyone knows, was a tanner. And Grant wanted nothing to do with the tannery, but anything to do with animals, anything to do with horses, he quite loved. And so this was something that came naturally to him, and that I think it also sort of reveals his powers of communication and observation in a strange way. I mean, I think he was able to measure people in a similar way that he measured horses in that respect.
Now, he didn't really want to go to West Point. How did he end up there, and what was the experience like for him?
Yeah, he had no desire. He didn't even really think about it as an option, but his father came home one day and said, "You're going." And Grant said, I won't go. And his father said, "Yeah, you will." And so he said, okay, if he thought I should go, I guess I would. So he ends up there. The most exciting prospect to him was the travel, actually. He took a steamer, he took a railroad trip, and he was going at, he said at a pace to annihilate time and space. It was probably 20 miles an hour. And he found this all fantastic. He ended up in Philadelphia for a while, visiting, and went to the theater, and his father reprimanded him for staying too long. And then he made his way up to West Point, of course. And he actually had some fear of failure that he had to overcome. His schooling, as students from the West, it would have been the case, was, sort of adequate, but not terrific. And the boy from his town who had his appointment before him had failed. So there was some pressure there, but he passed the entrance exams. And I think subsequent historians have tended to exaggerate his struggles there. He was sort of an average student in some things, quite good in others, fairly good in math and in horsemanship, not very good in tactics, as he freely admitted, really toward the bottom of his class. The other thing that he also reveals about his West Point experience is that he didn't find it that interesting. He said, "I never read a lesson twice over," and he spent most of his time reading novels. He said, "I couldn't sit in my room doing nothing," he tells us in the memoirs, "so I read novels, but not those of a trashy sort," he tells us.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Now, not long after he graduates, of course, he finds himself in war in Mexico. What was his attitude toward that war, if you will, and what did he take away from fighting in it?
He thought it was a terrible war. He says in the memoirs that it was a political war from first to last, the most unjust, he said, ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. That's, of course, the reflections of the older man on the earlier conflict. The correspondence from the time isn't as explicit about his sort of discontent. It is explicit about the hardships endured. More people died by disease than by combat in the Mexican War, and he lost many of his friends and comrades in that war. He found out some important things. You ask about the lessons he learned, some important things about himself. He found out that he had physical courage. He said that he wrote a letter where he said that bullets had more, that there was more to fear in anticipation than when he actually found himself in battle, where I think he didn't have time necessarily to think about it, but just responded. So he found that out, and I don't think that's anything you can find out until you're in the midst of it. He also, even though he found his way into almost every battle he could, he was actually designated as the regimental quartermaster because everybody knew he was good with horses. And of course, part of the quartermaster's portfolio was dealing with mules. So this is what they did. And he learned from that the importance of logistics. He learned the importance of feeding and supplying armies. He learned about the importance of camp sanitation. He worked in Mexico for two commanders, Taylor, who cared nothing at all for sanitation, and thus disease was rampant. And he learned a certain amount of resourcefulness and also studied Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, the two generals who commanded in Mexico.
Now, throughout the war, he was carrying out a long-distance romance with the woman who would become his wife, Julia Dent, and they married finally when he returned. Tell us a bit about his marriage and his family life.
I think he was really happiest with his family. They accompanied him to war during the Civil War whenever he could. He had his son with him sometimes. Late in the war, when his headquarters were at City Point in Virginia, he had his family with him when he could. I think they really gave him a sense of grounding. We had the testimony of his children, particularly his eldest child, about what a caring and kind father he was, how he used to read to them, how he used to play with them. And Frederick, his son, says that he was no martinet. He was not a disciplinarian really as a father. But Frederick has this wonderful quotation, which I really like, where he says he first created in a small child the feeling of absolute respect for him and belief in him. And he used to read to them, as I said, and the marriage was an interesting one in that he married into a slaveholding family and his own parents didn't come to the wedding. So they created, it was a great deal of tension.
Because of that, because they disagreed with that practice.
Right. So, you know, I think this brought, like many marriages of the time, it brought the political national issues to the fore.
The period of his life between the war in Mexico and the Civil War might well be called the lost years. What was he up to during that period?
So in the memoirs, he devotes only a few chapters to it. And if you really want to know what he was up to then, you have to go to other sources. The best of them, I think, is Lloyd Lewis in his book, Captain Sam Grant. And Lewis points toward one episode in particular that I think is also pertinent for today, when Grant had to cross the Isthmus of Panama, and there was a cholera epidemic at the time. And the senior officer there left Grant with the sick and went on to the coast. And Grant cared for the sick, contracted for mules to transport them. And I think saw there, as Lewis points out, he realized sort of for the first time that he could meet an emergency, that he could solve problems, that he was calm in the face of this emergency. And we have the testimony of many of the people who were on that miserable trip, how caring and concerned he was as he nursed the sick and got the survivors to the other coast, to the West Coast. So it was a very trying time. And then he ends up in the West Coast. He ends up in a series of remote posts in the Pacific Northwest where he's away from his family and he's really quite miserable. He writes really wrenching letters that one can read in the papers. And he's lonely, he doesn't get mail, the mail's not regular, the weather is terrible. Everything is just, it's a horrible scene. And he writes to Julia that he would resign were it not for the fact that poverty, he writes, stares him in the face. So he can't really figure out how otherwise to provide for them. And then when he does resign under somewhat cloudy circumstances. These are where the rumors, the stories of his drinking, and he probably did drink to excess when he was on the West Coast, as was a sort of, well-established Army practice, I think, at the time. There was not a tremendous, we have, people like George Crook and others, young officers who were posted out there suggest that that's really what went on the West Coast there. And goes home to St. Louis, fails at a number of ventures, and ends up, when the war breaks out, we find him in Galena, Illinois, working in his father's leather goods store.
So he then, of course, somehow arrives through the state needing to form militia and so forth. And in this process emerges as someone who has a West Point background, combat experience, and ability, and ends up at the fore and ends up in command early on as a one-star general in the developing Western theater. That theater is really nowhere near as well known to most Americans as is the Eastern theater, but that's really where he earned his reputation, and it's where he honed the art of command and demonstrated brilliance, really, as a tactical commander first at Donelson and so forth, and then as an operational level commander at the extraordinary Battle of Vicksburg. What were the most important lessons he learned in the Western theater?
Well, as you say, that's really where he learned his craft, I think. And sometimes that was by trial and error, but it was really a place of testing. He's there for the first time in command. He tells the story in the memoirs, first time he's in command of his regiment, and he's chasing a Confederate colonel in Missouri, and decides instead of sending scouts out, he doesn't call a halt, and sort of he's riding toward the crest of a hill where he might encounter the enemy, but he finds that the enemy camp has just been deserted. And he says at that point in the memoirs, I realized then that the enemy was just as afraid of me as I was of him. And he said that was a valuable lesson. And he said he would feel some anxiety in the future facing the enemy, but never a real fear. And I think that that was something that was important. And after that, at the tactical level, and then at Fort Donelson, where of course he has the famous moment where his old friend Simon Bolivar Buckner was left in command at Donelson by two rather incompetent commanders who depart in the night. And Buckner writes to his old friend and says, let's talk terms. And Grant replies, I'm not talking terms. I'll accept, only an unconditional surrender. And so that really, he begins to have some fame there. All the newspapers pick that up. And I think that he gains, you can sort of see him gaining some kind of confidence. Shiloh, however, although ultimately a victory, is a setback in that he is surprised the first day. He has not had Sherman and others entrench. And I think that, everybody sort of, it was no mystery that the Confederates were going to attack, but he was sort of caught unprepared. Does manage though, and there's that famous scene, and I know you like that scene on the first evening of Shiloh, where he and Sherman tells this story later in his life, that they meet under this tree, and Sherman's quite distraught. And I'll let you say the line because I know you like that.
Well, Grant is sitting under a tree with his slouch hat on, and the rain is dripping off out in front of him. He has the stub of a cigar in his mouth, as always. All of the available cover is being used as makeshift hospitals. He can hear the cries of the wounded still on the battlefield, others who are having limbs hacked off without anesthesia. And Sherman comes up and pauses for a moment and then says, well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we? And Grant says, yep, lick him tomorrow, though. And that has always captured me. It's a story I actually retold on several occasions during the surge in Iraq on very, very difficult days. And lick him tomorrow really did, to me, capture this indomitable sheer will of Grant, but very quiet. Again, not pounding his chest, not cheerleading, not doing anything particularly voluble, just merely lick them tomorrow. And they did. And in the end of the day, as you noted, after nearly being driven into the Tennessee River on day one, they get reinforcements in, they kill the Confederate commander, and they own the battlefield, albeit other than that, you almost would have called that particular battle a draw, I think. But he does survive. And of course, then he moves on to Vicksburg. And it's really the success at Vicksburg that catches Lincoln's eye and makes him believe that he finally might have a general aggressive enough to win the war. In fact, you'll recall another great anecdote, supposedly that Lincoln, upon being warned that Grant drank, supposedly replied, find out what he drinks and give it to the other generals, at least he fights. What was the relationship like between Grant and his commander-in-chief, Lincoln?
So like most of Lincoln's great quotes, he probably didn't say that one, but I think it captures sort of the essence, though, in the sense that Lincoln recognized this was someone who could get the job done. And so he really was not interested in scurrilous stories from his old Army cronies. And I think they had a fantastic relationship, largely because one of the reasons, well, Grant got results. The other was that he knew he was fighting a war in a larger political context. And he knew that his battlefield strategy had to harmonize with the overall strategy of the war and the war aims. And when those aims enlarged from preserving the Union to emancipation, Grant accordingly adopted his policies to suit that. And I think that that was important because not all commanders were attuned to that. They did what they wanted in their particular department, and sometimes Lincoln had to reverse their decisions because they strayed into making their own political decisions. So I think that turned out to be increasingly sort of the foundation of their bond. And I think that there's one letter in particular that's a great favorite of mine that Lincoln writes to Grant after Vicksburg, where, as you well know, Grant's strategy at Vicksburg, I mean, he tried lots of different things until something worked. He kept everybody busy, and then he finally bypassed the fort, and came around from the south, ran the batteries
on the Mississippi River.
Right, and then came around and fought Johnston's army, as well as fighting, then coming back to lay siege to Vicksburg. And after it was all over and Lincoln said, you know, I'm really glad you won and it was great. And he said, you know, while you were doing all this stuff, I wasn't exactly sure what was going on, but I figured you knew your own business better than I did. And then he said, finally, you know, you did what I thought you ought to do, which was run the batteries and come up from the south. He said, but I didn't say anything. And now I wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. And you would know better than I whether presidents write that to generals very often. But I find that to be a really telling letter.
I was always waiting for that. Of course, that campaign was incredibly risky in the end, because after going south of Vicksburg and going ashore, he throws loose of his supply lines and races out to the east to defeat piecemeal the Confederate reinforcements before they could reach Vicksburg, which, as you note, having fended off the reinforcements, defeated them in battle, he then could invest Vicksburg with a siege. But that campaign was so risky that, as you'll recall, Sherman had an official letter put in the file saying that he wanted to register his concerns about the risk. Again, the two most trusted commanders ultimately among the Union forces. And it was that battle that then, of course, prompts Lincoln to bring Grant east, to make him the commander of all Union forces. And then Grant develops a strategy that wins the war. Let's keep in mind that the most important of winning that was the success of forces on the battlefield in 1864 that ensured Lincoln's victory over McClellan, by now retired, no longer a general, having had his chance as the commander of the Union forces. And Lincoln so frustrated with him that he supposedly wrote a letter that said, if you're not going to use your forces, please loan them to me so that I can put them to use. And he ensures the victory over McClellan in the election of 1864, which, had McClellan won, he had announced in advance that he was going to sue for peace and arrange some kind of settlement with the South, and the Union would not be what it is today. So Lincoln has been, or Grant has been brilliant tactically. He's been brilliant at the operational level, larger level. Now he is in charge of the entire strategy. What was the essence of that strategy?
So you alluded to his comment to Meade, I think, where he said, you know, where Lee goes, you should follow. I think strategically,
that was the main effort.
Right. He makes a lot of important decisions. He takes about, when he finally comes east, he takes about 8 weeks, I think, to study everything. And he makes what I think, what historians have suggested, Fuller in particular makes this point. He has this insight to leave executive command of the Army of the Potomac to Meade. So he frees himself up to think strategically. And this area of his command is huge. We forget that. I mean, how it stretches, you know, from the Canadian border to the south and all the way to the west. And I think that leaving Meade with those administrative responsibilities really did help him to do that.
While still sitting in Meade's back pocket, right, to make sure that he does go where Lee goes, right, and does not back up to Washington, but just moves aside and hits him again in the wilderness. Right, and
keep going south. And
yes,
while he's holding Lee's army, this allows Sherman free maneuver through the south, and also Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, which is the breadbasket of the Confederacy. So by holding Lee's army in place and by really grinding it out in the most brutal warfare, he helps to free up Sherman and Sheridan, knowing, and this goes back to his relationship with Sherman, with whom he loses contact for part of the time, but he knows Sherman's doing what he's supposed to do, so he's not particularly concerned. There's really an absolute trust there. So that's really the idea, that he recognizes this is the way to win the war.
And the victories, of course, at Atlanta, and then in the Shenandoah Valley just before the election, are what seal that election for Lincoln, keeping in mind that, of course, in New York, as an example, there were draft riots, there was opposition to the war, great frustration, and so forth. And of course, with Sherman coming to Atlanta, then Savannah and up, and of course, you had forces coming out of the Tidewater area as well, never doing much, the Crater Battle and so forth. Sheridan going down the valley and picking it clean, and then Meade going right where Lee goes. And ultimately, of course, it culminates at Appomattox in April 1865. Now, the two central figures in this, Grant and Sherman, were really very different personalities. But each was arguably the other's most important professional relationship, certainly from Shiloh onward. In fact, you'll recall Sherman saying years after the war, Grant stood by me while I was crazy, and I stood by him while he was drunk. How did their relationship work, and why did it work?
Well, you're absolutely right to say they were very different personalities, although they were also both men of the West. And I think I mean, the West at the time is Ohio, right? But there was a kind of identity. The Western armies had a different character from the Army of the Potomac, and several officers noted that when they moved east with Grant. It was just a completely different way of operating. They had that trust. I think you mentioned Sherman's raising of objections when Grant cut loose from his supply line at Vicksburg. What's interesting there is that Grant mentions that quite freely and happily in the memoirs, because he says that Sherman came to him and they, behind closed doors, registered his concern. And I think he thus showed a great deal of loyalty in doing it, right? He gave his best opinion. Grant didn't take it, and Sherman did what he was told to do. And so this relationship really was quite wonderful in that respect. Sherman, of course, was senior to Grant. He graduated several years ahead of him. And it was only at Fort Donelson that they really started working together, Grant's first great success. And I think Grant took Sherman's measure when, even though Sherman outranked him at the time, he was assigned to supply Grant during the Donelson battle. And he wrote a letter saying, you know, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it. And there was no standing on ceremony. And I think Grant realized that this was not someone, unlike some of the other generals with whom he had to work, who were, you know, really concerned about the seniority and precedence and everything. Sherman didn't care about that. He just wanted to win. So I think they were like-minded in that respect. And then I think Sherman really was quite inspired by Grant's tenacity and by what he called his simple faith in success. And he made others believe they could succeed as well. And I think, you know, Sherman went through his own periods of real crisis after Bull Run, and periodically throughout the war. And I think Sherman really depended on Grant's sort of unflappable nature. He knew that he had a completely different personality. And I think he took great strength from that calm, that sense of calm that Grant exuded.
It's a wonderful, wonderful relationship. Now, I had a question sent from one of the viewers in advance that is a particularly intriguing one, I thought. And it asks, when one looks for indicators of future leadership in Grant, there were not that many, with a few exceptions, as you mentioned, in the Mexican War. He wasn't that high in his West Point class. He didn't succeed in his career once he went out west. He failed at numerous civilian endeavors. Yet he ended up, again, in my view now, being the only U.S. Army general to demonstrate brilliance in combat consistently at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels of war. And he did literally save the Union. Meanwhile, his friend and classmate, William Franklin, the top graduate in Grant's West Point class, proved unsuccessful as a general. Have you ever pondered the unlikely rise of Grant and thought about why so many of those who finished ahead of him in so many of the normal gates and progression to general officer ultimately didn't remotely achieve what he did?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think that what distinguished him was a great capacity to grow and to learn from mistakes and to learn from failure. And not everyone is able to do that. he never had, I think, that sort of fixed certainty, which in a hierarchical organization can sometimes lead to a kind of blindness. So I think he preserved that sort of flexibility and resilience. I think, again, I think people have exaggerated the degree to which, you know, he failed at West Point. I mean, I think he was indifferent to his studies, and I think that sort of showed in the sort of in his grades. However, he wanted to become a professor of mathematics, actually, until the Mexican War. So it wasn't that he was anti-intellectual in that sense, but I don't think that military culture particularly seized his imagination initially. But I think even all those qualities that later distinguished his leadership were in fact recognized by his peers. So if you go back and read people's accounts of him, they noticed his loyalty, they noticed his tenacity, they noticed a kind of fixity of purpose. And I think that really are the things, the hallmarks that distinguished him. I mean, and the other things that I think played a great role later on, he had a kind of instinctive knowledge of topography. You can see there's surviving drawings and paintings he did at West Point under the drawing master Robert Weir sort of reveal a great sort of visual orientation. But I think, and his staff officers say that he could take a look at a map and sort of know, but almost immediately, sort of photographic memory. And I think that served him in great stead. And the horsemanship as well allowed him to sort of, Keegan writes that, this was a period where as long as the battle line was growing, you could just about, if you were a good horseman, just about see the whole thing. And Grant did, and he would ride and see for himself. And so I think that those sorts of strengths were the ones that ended up being needed. I mean, I think, there's this thing to being the right leader at the right time. And I think he had those particular attributes. I think he was also not, because he wasn't steeped in military arts and science like the McClellans and the Hallecks of the world. I think it sort of led to a kind of creativity that manifested itself in his operational and strategic plans.
The other attribute that we've discussed in previous sessions was that he had an ability to see a battlefield. So he could see the map. He might have seen part of the battlefield, but he could picture it in his mind. And even more importantly, he could envision a battle playing out over time. And then he could, in his own mind again, because there were no staffs to speak of in those days. Of course, you wrote all of your own orders, and aides were there to deliver them to the commanders on the battlefield. But he could get those orders all in the right sequence and very concisely express what it was that he needed each of those subordinate commanders to do. And again, there is something there that is just God-given, I think, that is improved with training, certainly, but was a talent that really came out, I think, as he developed on the battlefield, commanding ever larger forces all the way up to the actual strategy, and indeed offering help to Meade at various points in time. As you'll recall, that curious relationship that they had where Meade didn't mind if Grant sent orders directly to the commanders who were working directly for Meade. And they again had that very good relationship. Meade having been grateful, of course, just that Grant kept him on,
right,
in the wake of Gettysburg and so forth, where he had failed to take advantage of the final day and the Confederacy hitting the high water mark and then retreating, and failed to pursue them as aggressively as certainly history would judge now, and Lincoln judged then he should have done. But let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about another attribute of Grant, and that is his writing. Of course, Mark Twain thought that he was a terrific writer, but as you noted, he was Grant's publisher, so he had a vested interest in saying so. But a number of others, prominent among them, Matthew Arnold, Henry James, Gertrude Stein, have also expressed great admiration for the general's prose. But you're the English professor. What distinguished Grant as a writer?
Well, I think I mentioned before his his interest in putting his meaning so plainly there could be no mistaking it. That's a phrase that he repeats several times in the memoirs. And my students often, they think English professors like what they call fluff. And I tell them I don't like fluff. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I like you to put your meaning so plainly there can be no mistaking it. So I will share with them some Grant and say, you know, he didn't like fluff, and look what happened to him. So there's this sense that he's a really good stylist. And he writes nothing like the books he read, which is very interesting as well. He has that narrative zest. He has wonderful descriptive powers. This is particularly true, I think, of the early chapters where he talks about Mexico. He really fell in love with the country of Mexico,
Yes.
despite being miserable during the war. And the descriptions of the people and the way of life and the scenery are really quite remarkable. And this is true also in his letters home, where he talks about various aspects of it. So, you know, he returned to Mexico. It really won him over. And so there's just a wonderful, the powers of observation and the ability to communicate what he sees in a wonderful, a spare and lean, but nevertheless compellingly descriptive way. I think is really important. And the other thing that I think is extremely compelling to me about the memoirs is the way that it's his story, but it's his story in the great story of the Civil War. And that's, I think, also, there are lots of reasons why it ends with the end of the war, but I think one of the most important is that he regards his own story. You know, part of the reason he didn't want to write it is he didn't think people, you know, what story did he have to tell? But if he had one story to tell, it was that of the great national cataclysm, and that's why people would want to hear from him.
Well, to continue this line of questioning, if you will, and the following two questions also were submitted from the audience. Twain compared Grant's memoirs to Caesar's commentaries. That is pretty substantial praise. Is that an apt comparison?
Well, I think that's Mark Twain's version of the blurbs you find on the back of the book, right? Not since Homer, not since the Bible has there been a book this wonderful. So that's Twain as salesman. I think it's apt in the sense that it is, as military memoirs go, it has as big an impact as Caesar's did, in the sense that, I mean, military historians regard it as on that level. You know, I came, I saw, I conquered. You're never going to see anything like that in Grant. So in terms of, I mean, after all, right, Caesar's a man who referred to himself in the third person. This is not Grant's way. It was Winfield Scott's way, but not Grant's. And so I think in terms of the style and the personality, hugely different. But in terms of an account of war and a compelling narrative of wars, that clearly, you know, that that's what he was doing, right? He wanted people to think that, you know, this was the next best thing to Caesar. And I think it, you know, I mean, I don't think there's any more powerful military memoir certainly in American history. Sherman's is quite wonderful, but I think Grant's stands alone.
Now, you write that Grant's greatness was entirely, emphatically American. Why do you seem to regard him as the consummate American?
So when I wrote that, I had in mind Washington, because people compare Grant to Washington frequently. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, said that the three great Americans were Lincoln, Washington, and Grant. I think Washington's greatness, which is substantial, was a sort of amalgamation. I mean, he had a kind of aristocratic sensibility. He was a gentleman from Virginia. His sense of military rank and his sense of sort of military as a profession, I think, was very much an old world one, but he happened to fuse that strangely and wonderfully for us with a Republican sensibility. Grant had none of that. He begins his memoir discussing that he's American, his family has been American for however many generations. As I've mentioned, you know, growing up in the West, I think he felt very much on the frontier. And I think that he he did not regard, he was not a gentleman in that sense, although he was a very gentle person, I think. He didn't have that sort of sense of an aristocratic sense of being an officer and a gentleman. He was a very different kind of more modern figure, I think.
Well, let me bring this to a close with two final questions. And I want to return in this one to a point you made at the outset, that one of the obstacles preventing us from celebrating Grant as a hero can be traced to the ways in which Americans have chosen to remember the Civil War. One aspect of that commemoration has been in the news a good bit of late, questioning the memorialization of Confederates throughout statuary, place names, base names, and other public honors. What would Grant have thought about the fact that we are utterly surrounded by tributes to the enemy he did so much to defeat, and whose leaders, after all, really were, at the end of the day, defending a truly abhorrent practice, slavery?
I think that, and in his memoirs, he's very clear. He says that is one of the worst causes for which anyone has ever thought, and one for which there is the least excuse. He was a reconciliationist, but as Joan Waugh says quite eloquently, on Northern terms. And I think he actually would have been quite mystified at the degree to which the idolatry of Southern heroes has sort of eclipsed really a celebration of the Union or of the Northern side. That mythology, which historians like David Blight and Eric Foner have written about at length, the mythology of the lost cause really triumphed after the Civil War. And I think, you mentioned the base names, I think that in particular, Grant would have found really completely mystifying, that we have so many Army bases named for Confederate generals, and also Confederate generals like, for example, Leonidas Polk, who were actually terrible generals. They were not skilled at their job. So it's a very peculiar thing that this is what has happened, and this is how we have commemorated that war, which he understood, I think, in very different terms.
Well, before we close the conversation this evening, I'd like to ask you to share with us one of your favorite passages, and perhaps one of the most surprising items you discovered in Grant's memoirs.
Well, it's always a hard choice for me because there are so many passages that I like. I thought I'd share one that I like to share with my students. When I can, I like to read the memoirs as a whole with them, but when I can't, or when I want to talk to them about the relationship of writing and soldiering, I often read this passage, which comes from the end of the 10th chapter of the memoirs. And it describes General Winfield Scott and General Zachary Taylor, who are the two generals for whom Grant worked in Mexico. And it's a beautiful companion portrait, which shows also his powers of observation and the way one of the things that I like most about the memoirs is the fact that it's punctuated by these lovely character sketches. In very few words, he's able to give you a portrait of various historical figures. So this is Scott and Taylor. I had now been in battle with the two leading commanders conducting armies in a foreign land. The contrast between the two was very marked. General Taylor never wore a uniform, but dressed himself entirely for comfort. He moved about the field in which he was operating to see through his own eyes the situation. Often he would be without staff officers, and when he was accompanied by them, there was no prescribed order in which they followed. He was very much given to sit his horse sideways, with both feet on one side, particularly on the battlefield. General Scott was the reverse in all these particulars. He always wore all the uniform prescribed or allowed by law when he inspected his lines. Word would be sent to all divisions and brigade commanders in advance, notifying them of the hour when the commanding general might be expected. This was done so that all the army might be under arms to salute their chief as he passed. On these occasions, he wore his dress uniform, cocked hat, aiguillette, saber, and spurs. His staff proper, besides all officers constructively on his staff, engineers, inspectors, quartermasters, etc., that could be spared, followed, also in uniform and in prescribed order. Orders were prepared with great care and evidently with the view that they should be a history of what followed. And now Grant devotes an entire paragraph to the way they communicate, which I think is fascinating. In their modes of expressing thought, these two generals contrasted quite as strongly as in their other characteristics. General Scott was precise in language, cultivated a style peculiarly his own, was proud of his rhetoric, not averse to speaking of himself, often in the third person, and he could bestow praise upon the person he was talking about without the least embarrassment. Taylor was not a conversationalist, but on paper, he could put his meaning so plainly that there could be no mistaking it. He knew how to express what he wanted to say in the fewest well-chosen words, but would not sacrifice meaning to the construction of high-sounding sentences. But with their opposite characteristics, both were great and successful soldiers. Both were true, patriotic, and upright in all their dealings. Both were pleasant to serve under. Taylor was pleasant to serve with.
How wonderful. And a lovely way to conclude a wonderful retrospective on the man who saved the Union and went on to be its president, and then to write the clearest, most forthright, and most directly eloquent memoirs of any US military commander, which your annotations bring alive truly beautifully. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you. This was great.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks.